The pharmaceutical company Alkermes has been attempting to pull a fast one on the FDA by using unprecedented data manipulation tactics in trying to get an antidepressant medication approved. I will explain in a little bit how these data manipulation tactics work and how they have never been used before by any other company that has attempted to get a medication approved by the FDA. In light of a recent vote by an FDA advisory committee to reject this medication, it doesn't look like the FDA is going to fall for Alkermes' scam. The FDA advisory committee on November 1st of 2018 voted 21-2 to reject this medication. All medications, before they are approved, do get voted upon by an outside advisory panel of experts, and the panel's decision is non-binding. The FDA could theoretically approve this drug still, and they have until January 31st of 2019 to make that decision. However, usually the FDA makes the same decision as its advisory committee does, and they always take into account the opinions of the advisory committee. The fact that over 90% of the advisory committee voted to reject this medication is a very dismal result. Perhaps even more telling that the FDA will probably reject this medication by January 31st of 2019 is the briefing document. This is a document that actually was written by the FDA and given to the advisory panel before they made their decision. I have read all 143 pages of this document. It's available on the FDA's website, and I can tell you it's pretty much a scathing review of the data that Alkermes provided. They cite several times in which they seem to be saying that Alkermes is blatantly trying to manipulate the data. For one thing, the FDA highly criticizes SPCD, which is a form of data manipulation that Alkermes tried to use in their studies. SPCD is short for Sequential Parallel Comparison Design. It is essentially an attempt to manipulate the data by trying to artificially reduce the placebo effect. In SPCD trials, they have two stages. In both stages, there is a group of people that take a placebo and a group of people who take the actual medication. But what they do is they take the people who responded well to the placebo in stage 1 and essentially take them out of the data in stage 2. The purpose of doing this is to make it appear as though the medication is more effective than it actually is in comparison to the placebo. In my previous video on this medication, I explain how SPCD works in detail. Go watch that video for more information. I'll leave a link in the description. In that video, I stated that the FDA rejected this medication, and at the time that was actually true. The FDA sent Alkermes a refusal to file letter in early April of 2018, but later, after I made that video, they rescinded the refusal to file letter. When you get a refusal to file letter, that means the FDA is basically saying that the data is not adequate enough for them to even consider approving the medication. Well, Alkermes was able to convince the FDA that they should at least consider approving the medication, but that doesn't mean that it's going to be approved. And the FDA, like I said earlier, has until January 31st of 2019 to make a decision. Frankly, I'm glad the FDA seems to be skeptical of SPCD because if Alkermes is allowed to use this form of data manipulation, then other pharmaceutical companies will start using this form of data manipulation as well. Also, SPCD wasn't actually all that successful at reducing the placebo response, according to the FDA, because as you can see in these charts from 3 different studies that Alkermes used, the difference between the placebo and the medication was about the same in stage 1 as it was in stage 2, even though, in theory, the difference between the medication and the placebo should be greater in stage 2, since they took out the people who responded well to the placebo in stage 2. If you are currently taking an antidepressant medication that has actually been approved by the FDA for depression and you feel that it has helped your depression, it is actually a statistical fact that most of the benefit that you are getting from this medication is just the placebo effect. As you can see from these charts, this medication, even with all the data manipulation, is just a little bit more effective than the placebo. And this is actually true for pretty much all of the antidepressants that are currently on the market for depression. If they are better than the placebo at all, they are just maybe slightly better than the placebo. The part of the FDA that approves psychiatric medications is considered one of the most lenient parts of the FDA. That's why there have been so many antidepressants that have been approved that at best are just a little bit more effective than a placebo, and maybe no more effective at all than a placebo. Another way Alkermes has attempted to manipulate the data is by using the MADRS6 rather than the MADRS10. MADRS stands for the Montgomery-Ashburg Depression Rating Scale. The MADRS10 is a method of quantifying depression. There is no objective way to quantify depression. There is also no objective way to quantify pain or any other emotion. So when testing things like antidepressants, they usually use something like the MADRS10, which is pictured here. It is a scale. It is essentially a subjective assessment made by a clinician. The clinician, on a scale of 0 to 6, quantifies 10 different symptoms, which are apparent sadness, reported sadness, inattention, reduced sleep, reduced appetite, concentration difficulties, lassitude, inability to feel, pessimistic thoughts, and suicidal thoughts. So usually there will be a baseline where before the person starts on the antidepressant, they will get a baseline quantification of how depressed they are on this scale. Then they might see them, say, every week, and once again, quantify how depressed they are. And at the end of the study, they will see how much the person went down on this scale. The lower your number on this scale, the less depressed you are. They will also do this for the people who are taking placebos. And usually people who are taking placebos will also see their number on this scale greatly reduced. The MADRS6 is basically the same thing as the MADRS10, except that they eliminate 4 of these 10 items. Specifically, they eliminate reduced sleep, reduced appetite, concentration difficulties, and suicidal thoughts. These 4 items are known to hurt antidepressants in clinical trials because a lot of times antidepressants actually make these things worse. Perhaps most notoriously, a lot of antidepressants actually increase suicidal thinking. That's why the FDA requires most antidepressants to have a black box warning, which is the most serious kind of warning the FDA can require, that says that this medication can actually cause suicidal thinking in some people. And we know that this suicidal thinking is actually being caused by the antidepressant and not by depression, because the increase in suicidal thinking goes up in a statistically significant way in comparison to the people who are taking the placebo. Alkermes has justified removing these 4 items because they are claiming that they have nothing to do with actual depression. Yes, that's right. Alkermes is saying that suicidal thinking isn't really related to depression, and therefore they shouldn't have to measure it. But here's the thing. This is very convenient for Alkermes because if this medication increases suicidal thinking, they don't have to worry about that because they're not even going to bother to count that. The FDA doesn't appear to be buying it. The FDA said that they actually told Alkermes back in February of 2017 that, and this is quoting directly from the briefing document, "We have not previously accepted the MADRS6 as a primary efficacy endpoint for a clinical trial. Before accepting this instrument as a primary endpoint in a trial intended to support product registration, we need data on the validity and reliability of the instrument and clear documentation of how the biometric properties of the MADRS6 compare to the MADRS10. On face, we have concerns that the MADRS6 omits diagnostically and clinically important aspects of depression. But it looks like Alkermes tried not to listen to this and just went ahead and tried to use the MADRS6 anyway. The FDA did say elsewhere in this document that they determined that the MADRS6 is simply not a sufficient measurement of depression. This brings us to a third major way in which Alkermes has attempted to manipulate the data, and that is they have been attempting to use averages. To quote directly from the briefing document, "We do not agree with the strategy of comparing baseline MADRS6 or MADRS10 scores to the average scores from week 3 to the end of the efficacy period. We note that the averaging of the change in MADRS6 or MADRS10 scores tends to obscure a possible drop-off in drug efficacy after the first few weeks of treatment. In study 205, the change in MADRS10 scores reached a peak at week 3. In study 207, the change in MADRS6 and MADRS10 scores both reach a peak at week 4. It is important for us to know whether the drug has an effect that persists until the end of the study. We recommend using a single efficacy measure at the end of the study and not the average over multiple time periods as the primary efficacy endpoint." So, to explain this, usually when an antidepressant is tested, they look at the baseline score on a depression rating scale. The MADRS is one of those depression rating scales. Another one is the Hamilton Depression Rating Scale, but that one wasn't used for these studies. However, the FDA does consider the MADRS10 to be a valid measurement of depression. Like I said, there is no such thing as an objective way to quantify depression, but the FDA considers the MADRS10 to be valid. They don't really consider the MADRS6 to be valid. Anyway, when you test a medication, usually you take the baseline score on the MADRS10 or whatever depression rating scale you are using, and you compare it to how the people scored at the end of the study. And basically, their improvement is how much they improved, and also you compare how much the people on the placebo improved, because if the people in taking the medication did not improve any more than the people taking the placebo, then that means the drug was not truly an effective medication, and most, if not all of its effects are simply the placebo effect. Well, Alkermes decided that they did not want to use that protocol. Instead, they decided to take an average of the depression rating scale tests over time. So every week they would do a assessment, and they would assess how much a person is depressed going by the MADRS scale. And they would use an average instead of looking at how much they improved at the end of the study. As the FDA noted, the problem with this is that it has a tendency to obscure the drop-off of efficacy of an antidepressant after the first few weeks. As the FDA pointed out in their own clinical trials, it seemed that the peak efficacy, at least in comparison to the placebo, for this medication was around week 3 or 4, but then its efficacy dropped off in comparison to the placebo. Now, the thing is, these antidepressants are meant to be taken long-term, and they're really not very valuable if they have a effect that peaks around 3 weeks or 4 weeks and then drops off. This medication had 2 unsuccessful phase 3 trials and 1 successful phase 3 trial. But the only reason the third phase 3 trial was successful was because they changed the third phase 3 trial to take into account an average of the MADRS10 rather than looking at how much the patients improved at the end of the study. But it looks like the FDA is saying that that is not adequate. Usually, the FDA requires 2 successful phase 3 trials at least in order to approve a medication. In fact, in the past, they have never approved a medication with just 1 successful phase 3 trial. And in this case, they changed how they were doing the data to make sure the third one would be successful. Like I said before, the part of the FDA that approves psychiatric medications is known to be lenient, and in the past they have approved an SSRI antidepressant that had 4 unsuccessful phase 3 clinical trials, but 2 successful ones. And that was enough to get it approved, even though the majority of the phase 3 trials were unsuccessful. Here, once again, we have a situation in which 2 out of the 3 phase 3 trials were actually unsuccessful, but it would be unprecedented for the FDA to allow a medication to be approved with just 1 successful phase 3 clinical trial. I am not the biggest fan of Richard Pops, the CEO of Alkermes. He does come across to me as somebody who doesn't really care about patients and primarily cares about making profit, often at the expense of patients. Currently, the most profitable medication Alkermes has is Vivitrol, and they have engaged in some very, very questionable marketing tactics for that medication. But in the case of this one, ALKS 5461, if it is approved, it would be expected to dwarf Vivitrol in sales because the depression market is a very big market, and most antidepressants on the market right now are not very effective, and there's a lot of people who have major depressive disorder. But the problem is, if this was just a case of a medication that was tested and didn't work, that wouldn't be a problem because that happens all the time. At least 90% of medications that are created by pharmaceutical companies end up not being approved. Most of them don't make it this far in the process. What I really take exception to in this case is the blatant manipulation of the data, because essentially what Alkermes is trying to do is scam the FDA into approving this medication, and I really don't think the FDA should do so. I want to point out that what's good for pharmaceutical companies is not always what's good for the mentally ill. A lot of times, what's good for psychiatrists and what's good for pharmaceutical companies are actually to the detriment of the mentally ill. But Richard Pops wants people to believe that if something is bad for Alkermes and if something is bad for ALKS 5461, that's bad for people who are depressed in general. In the press release following the recommendation of the advisory panel 21-2 that the FDA reject this medication, Richard Pops was quoted as saying, "We are disappointed and surprised by the FDA's characterization of the safety and efficacy data for ALKS 5461 and the resulting outcome of the advisory committee vote, particularly for the patients, their families, and treatment providers who need and deserve access to novel therapies that work differently than currently available antidepressants." Well, here's the thing. It's not good for people who are depressed or their families to have people taking an overpriced, expensive antidepressant that doesn't actually work any better than a placebo. People who are depressed, if they want to take a placebo, if they want to take a sugar pill, they can do so. They don't need to go to a doctor. They don't need to spend a lot of money like they would if this medication was approved. And they could get the same benefit that this medication seems to provide simply by taking a placebo. So it really doesn't help people who are depressed to approve a medication that doesn't actually work any better than the placebo. There's a reason why the placebo trials are required for all medications when they are approved by the FDA. And that is, if a medication isn't any better than a placebo, then you might as well just take a placebo. It's a whole lot less expensive. Although it is true that it is good for Richard Pops if a medication that doesn't work made by his company is approved, and it is also true that Richard Pops would probably become even richer than he already is. And it's also true that Alkermes, when they submitted this application for approval, increased their sales force greatly and was really hoping that this medication was going to be approved and was expecting it to be approved and considered it the number one product in their pipeline. And once again, I will reiterate that it is still possible that the FDA will approve this medication. They have until January 31st of 2019 to make that decision. but it really isn't looking like they're going to, especially when you consider the vote of the advisory panel and probably even more importantly, the tone of the briefing document made by the FDA on this medication. I also want to point out that this medication is a combination of buprenorphine and samidorphan. If you want information about how it works, or at least how it's supposed to work, please see my previous video on ALKS 5461. I will leave a link to it in the description. In that video, I go into great detail about the pharmacology of ALKS 5461. I also explain why I don't think this medication is going to be particularly effective in that video. So if you like this video, go ahead and give it a like, and if you haven't already, subscribe to my channel, click the bell icon for notifications, join the Zork Army, and together we shall take over the world. You can also follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Snapchat at ZorkMid123, and I also broadcast on Younow and Twitch under ZorkMid123.